Cold, dark, lifeless. Cosmicreach is all about blocks and little else. It's time to bring some life in with items and mobs. Up to this point, we haven't been saving the inventory, which is pretty terrible unless you plan on never exiting the game. We need to serialize items to binary data so that we can save, load, and transfer over the network, for both the player's inventory and for inventories of containers in the world. To make this work, we need a serialization format that stores types, names, and values, since we can't rely on a fixed structure like how block data is stored. Item data can be somewhat arbitrary after all. We start with a list of strings that are to be used. Whenever a string value is written, it's written by the ID that references this list, rather than literally, so that only unique strings are stored. Then we have a schema, which describes how the data is set out. If there are sub-objects in the data, they have their own schemas, reusing the same ones wherever possible, which minimizes how much data is stored. Each item in the schema has a byte describing the type and a name. The byte 0 is used to tell the serializer that the schema is ended. Then bytes 1 to 9 describe primitives, and byte 10 describes a composite object. Then we have another 10 bytes to describe the array variants of these. Lastly, we have the actual data, which is formatted according to the schema. This is in a similar representation as the region's save files. As an example, a string is stored as an integer for the length, followed by the string's bytes. With this, anything can be stored, which is perfect for block entities, allowing me to implement the basic storage for items, a wooden crate. We can now exit and return to the game, and all items will be saved. But remember, we can save arbitrary data now, which is absolutely perfect for mobs. That just leaves the process of rendering them. We have a hierarchy of bones, which represents a transform in 3D space. That is to say, scale, rotation, and translation, alongside how they relate to other bones. Bones propagate the transforms to their children recursively. Each bone may have multiple cubes that are attached, which renders the model as is. Then we have the animations, which are a list of keyframes of each bone modifying the transforms. The biggest issue I encountered here is that since every transform is represented by a matrix, I had to make sure that the matrix was transformed in the right order, which took a bothersome amount of trial and error, since it was very order dependent. For example, if you take a unit square, centered at the origin, and scale by a factor of 2, and move it by 1 unit in the x direction, you end up with a square centered at x equals 1 with a size of 2. But if you move it by 1 unit and then scale by a factor of 2, you end up centered at x equals 2 instead. With all that, it's time for our first hostile mob, the Interceptor. I wanted to add a simple mob that could be the foundation of future mobs going forward, without too many features, yet feeling complete as is. I decided a flying drone would be the best fit for multiple reasons. Firstly, I wouldn't have to deal with legs on the ground yet. Secondly, we can get away with not having proper pathfinding. Pathfinding is usually pretty simple in theory, but there is a lot of performance aspects to consider to make a good implementation. We'll touch up on this in a future episode. As far as the drone is concerned, if something is in the way, we'll just blindly bump into it instead of going around. Now, let's get into the design of the drone. It has a spinning blade, which in design language tells the player it's definitely going to hurt. It has 4 little nubs at the bottom, which imply it's how the drone maneuvers. And it has a visor to see you with, and the red color communicates it's hostile. The body of the drone is made of the same metal material as the metal block already in the game, which is consistency in design. Special thanks to Invern on Discord for guiding me in creating good looking mobs. The drone makes passive noises I made by manipulating the sounds of household appliances I recorded with my phone. The drone surrounds the player, winds up for a second, and then strikes to deal damage. However, in testing it, I found it a little too persistent in current state, popping in out of nowhere and harassing the player with little recourse since they can just fly over to you. To solve this issue, I created a second mob, the Interceptor trap, which, when you go near it, opens to spawn interceptors. Since the traps spawn naturally and the interceptors don't, there's more control in the hands of the player until I'm more satisfied with the spawning mechanics. For now, the Interceptor drops most blocks in the game, excluding the lights, which are dropped by the traps when hit. This means that the foundations of survival mode are there, since there's a way to get every non-naturally generated block that the drones can damage the player. In addition, if the player dies, a death screen appears, which is stylized with a shader that has horizontal bars scrolling to give it that sci-fi aesthetic. Now, another aspect I worked on to make the world feel alive is the dynamic sky, which takes the position of the sun and calculates the color of the sky, including the colors to show on the horizon. which during sunrise and sunset takes on reds and yellows depending on the dot product between the sky's position and the sun, the Earth as a result, is a lot more immersive than just a bland single color, and will set up neatly for the upcoming survival updates. I asked you guys about name suggestions for the flying drone, and I got pretty creative responses such as Seeker and Trimmer. In the end, I didn't go with these, but it did point me in the right direction, going with the Interceptor, which is slightly more aggressive. As with survival mechanics, oxygen and pressure should be taken into consideration, especially since space would likely play a big factor in the final game. I've decided against the mandatory hunger system, however. The way I see it, if you don't take damage, you ought not to need to eat. Although I haven't played the new Zelda games, I think they do quite well with their cooking system, where food provides direct healing and buffs, as opposed to starvation mechanics. With particle systems, it's an aspect of polish that the game needs when I get the chance, vital for breaking blocks and having potential in entities. I've also heard the importance of the particles being pixel perfect to the textures, so rest assured, I will take this into account when adding it. A while back I talked about getting burnt out in developing this game, and safe to say, I'm over that now, especially with recent releases that have come out. Even though the basic game loop still isn't complete, I see the potential in the game again. So with that, let's talk about the feature roadmap. Firstly, we need to finish the current sprint of basic survival. We need a crafting system, ores, tools, and a way to heal your health. The new world gen will come soon after that, in a basic state. After that, we'll go back to working on multiplayer. Multiplayer will likely be very distinct at first, only dealing with shared generated chunks, then sending changes to blocks, then synchronizing block events and entities. In that order. Will Alpha come after this? Well, not unless the severe graphical glitches on integrated GPUs are dealt with. Until those are taken care of, I cannot declare this next stage of development ready. I did have a lot of trouble making sure that Macs worked properly, which did contribute to some burnout, but the game works perfectly well on the air now, with some minor Intel-related exceptions here and there. So trust me when I say, although I can't get to it right away, I consider it vital before entering Alpha. With that, stay tuned, take care, and I'll see you next time.